Hey X-Files, I've been reading your creepypasta for some time, so I figured I'd contribute some of my own. There are a few stories I want to tell, all linked. Here's the first of them. It starts a bit slow. A few years back, I took a job working at a research station out in the woods. It was a pretty shabby place, donated by some rich family to a local university that converted most of it into labs and classrooms. There were a few dorms built up where the researchers and students lived. Little tiny box, one bedrooms with kitchenettes and no internet. I worked long hours most days, starting around 7 a.m. and often ending after 9 p.m., just before sunset. The lab I worked in was a converted attic in the old boathouse, and after work I'd watch the sunset from the dock where a few rowboats were anchored and used for research. I discovered the second week I was out there that I could use the internet from our lab while sitting on the docks, so I started bringing my laptop out there at night. It was only a little netbook, so I couldn't do much more than send emails and read the news. As such, I wound up taking my emails very seriously, writing them with the care and detail that people used in letters back when it could take weeks for one to reach its destination. The battery usually died after about an hour, and I'd pack up and go to bed. After a week or two of this routine, I had become accustomed to my solitude and felt rather philosophical about the whole thing. One night, much to my annoyance, a group of people showed up with quite a bit of booze. There were 6 of them, 4 girls and 2 guys, and they had between them 2 handles of liquor and a 6-pack. I had intended to weather the interruption and was gritting my teeth when the guy called to me, asking if I wanted a drink. I walked over and grabbed a beer and introduced myself. For the sake of anonymity, I am of course changing the names. Let us call them Dave, Ryan, Ann, Kelly, Ron, and Rachel. They were all in the same boat as me that summer, working as research assistants to professors, and had met in the dining hall. To save money, I had taken to cooking my own meals, and as a result, hadn't actually met anyone else working out there before. We went over our cursory discussions of what we were working on, but it didn't take long to figure out that they were, like me, a bit burnt out on work. After a bit of drinking, everyone undressed and started swimming off the docks in our underwear or swimsuits. I had always been terrified of water, especially water with things living in it. Fish frightened me, and I had seen some of the pike that were pulled out of this lake by fishermen. Giant toothy maws haunted my thoughts, but I dove into the water wearing my shorts, and we all swam and splashed around and had fun. After a few minutes I got out of the water, and the others followed eventually. We passed around the bottles and started talking about where we had all come from. It turned out I had traveled the shortest distance, having come in from Chicago only an hour away. Dave was from the East Coast. Ann and Ryan were both from Europe, and everyone else was from somewhere in the Midwest, usually no more than 2 states away. Things quieted down and we shifted into smaller groups, and I found myself talking with Dave and Kelly. We were sharing a bottle of rum, and after taking a swig I noticed Ann sitting on the edge of the dock by herself. "Hey Ann, you okay?" I called out, wondering if she was getting sick from drinking. "What are you talking about, dude?" Ryan called with a fake American accent. I looked over and started to say, "She's sitting at the end of the dock. I think she might be sick," and realized immediately that what I was saying made no sense. She was sitting right next to him. I know I wasn't crazy. She was the only brunette with us. I checked over everyone on the dock, counted and did my best to remember names, and slowly looked back to the end of the docks. The person sitting there was naked, waist-length dark hair covering her back and falling slightly onto the dock behind her. I heard her giggle and she turned her head slightly. She was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, and from what I could see her eyes were entirely black. "Want to go for a swim?" she said, half giggling, and splashed forward into the water. Everyone was quiet for what felt like an eternity. I listened intently to see if I could hear whoever it was resurface, but I never did. A good 15 minutes passed and I started backing away from the water. No one said anything. We just got out of there and went our respective ways. Ryan wound up going back to Ann's room with her, and Dave went back with Kelly. I decided to comfort what was left of our booze. I didn't talk about that night with anyone for some years, but the next evening as I was leaving work I saw something written on the second floor door, the one that leads down to the docks. In dripping, muddy letters I could make out the word, swim. We all kept hanging out that summer, but we stuck to the woods and fields from then on. I hated working late in that boathouse and made sure it was always locked when I was in there. Near the end of my time out there I started working even later, not going to bed until midnight or later, and the days got shorter. I'd hear giggling coming from down below, and would always chalk it up as younger kids I hadn't met swimming off the docks. A few nights I'd find muddy footprints leading from the water up to the second floor door, right up to the windows. I never opened the door and kept the blinds down whenever I was in there. Dave contacted me about 2 months back. He still lived on the East Coast. I had never mentioned the words on the door to him, but what he told me sent chills down my spine. See, of all of us, Dave never seemed to think anything had actually happened that night. I'll post his story in a little bit. Dave had always been an avid surfer, chased storms up and down the East Coast. There was a little stretch that was his own, though, his beach. He worked there on and off at a little restaurant waiting tables. He'd go in early in the morning and catch some waves, changing in the restrooms before work. One morning he came back from surfing and let himself into the building to get ready for his morning shift. He found a trail of muddy footprints and water leading from the kitchen into the men's room and back into the kitchen. He went back into the kitchen and found that the back door had been left open and assumed some kid had come in and used the bathroom. He shrugged and went to change. As he walked out of the stall, he noticed something smudged on the mirror. Swim. He didn't know what I had seen back then and wasn't able to connect it to what happened to us that night. I feel bad about this, but I don't know that it would have made any difference. See, from then on he'd find those prints every few weeks. He complained about his co-workers leaving the doors open for kids to break in, but no one could figure out who the culprit was. They made it a policy to double-check the doors from the outside when closing up, and they were never left unlocked. Then one morning, as he was coming back in from the surf, he saw someone sitting on the beach. She was completely naked, and long black hair was covering her front. He couldn't see much of her from the distance, but he assumed that it was going to be his lucky day. He smiled and wiped his hair back and waved to her as he approached. She smiled back at him. He started to say hey, but as he got closer, he noticed something was weird about her. Her smile was incredibly wide and her eyes were completely black. His steps faltered and he stopped in the surf a few feet away. Her grin kept growing and her mouth opened wide, revealing thin, shark-like teeth. He dropped his board and bolted down the surf away from her. She kept grinning and dove into the water and disappeared beneath the waves. He ran up the beach as fast as he could, putting as much distance between him and the water as possible. When he got to work, he changed and pretended like nothing had happened, trying to ignore what he'd just seen. He had been incredibly paranoid after that, and avoided going out onto the beach. Every girl with dark, long hair was a potential threat, and he was constantly on edge. He had a freak-out one day and grabbed a girl who he saw giggling a few feet from him, facing towards the water. I guess he yelled at her quite a bit. "Leave me alone, what do you want?" etc., etc. He wound up getting put on probation for assault and wasn't allowed to leave the state. I'm not going to say what state it was, but it was a small one and you were never very far from the coast. He lived less than a mile from the water, worked less than 100 yards from it, and spent the majority of his time able to see straight out into the ocean. And that's about all he did for nearly a year. Just stared out at the water. He had taken to falling asleep sitting up in a chair facing out his front window looking at the water every night, trying to make sure nothing was coming for him. He awoke to giggling around 3 a.m. about a month before he called me. He saw a girl standing not 100 feet from his front porch, facing the water. Her long black hair hung down past her waist. He jumped out of his chair and grabbed a bat he kept near him at all times, and stormed out of his front door screaming at her. She kept giggling and started walking towards the water. He tried to catch up with her, but every time he sped up, she seemed to do the same. By the time they were only a handful of yards from the water, he was in a dead sprint after her, his bat raised threateningly. She stopped, her feet catching the spray from the waves that ventured furthest on the shore, and turned to face him. "Swim?" she said, grinning. He stopped so suddenly he nearly fell over, using his bat to hold himself upright. There she was, standing right in front of him, with that horrible grinning mouth. But behind her he could make out other silhouettes, half a dozen if not more, out in the surf. The moon shone down on them, revealing thin, naked bodies draped in long black hair. A light from a car driving behind them flashed across the scene, revealing hundreds of thin shark-like teeth between them, lined up like soldiers behind their inhuman grins. He screamed and raised his bat to defend himself as they slowly made their way up the surf towards him. He swung at her, the closest one, as hard as he could and missed. It unbalanced him so much that he found himself face down in the sand, staring sideways at the smiling faces above him. She began to kneel down next to him and reached her arms towards him. Her fingers ended in long, sharp nails. Not claws, but as though they were human and were filed into points an inch or so past the tip of the fingers. She brushed them across his face, drawing thin lines of blood on his cheek, and kept smiling. Sorry about the delay. I wrote a few of these posts in advance, thinking I would give myself a decent buffer while I finished writing, but I have just reached the end of my buffer, hence the short post. There is quite a bit more to come, and I apologize for the lack of details in this bit. I had to take creative license for some of it and remove quite a bit of swearing as he told it to me over the phone. I'm pretty sure he was horribly drunk at the time. He came to not long after, laying on his back in the sand. There were 2 police officers standing over him, and I guess when he woke up he started kicking and flailing at them. They got him to calm down eventually after holding his back to the sand for a few minutes, making sure their badges were illuminated out there at the edge of the water. They told him one of the property owners had just come home and heard screaming coming from the beach and called them. They found him laying there, blood dripping from 3 long cuts on his cheek, completely non-responsive. They assumed he was drunk or high, yelling at manatees or whales or something. I guess when they showed up there was a lot of splashing coming from the water. It had stopped by the time he was coherent. Anyway, he had mainly called to ask me if he could crash at my place. I had moved further from the Great Lakes and was several hours away from any large bodies of water. He skipped out on his probation and had started driving west, away from the ocean. We had always kept in touch on Facebook, not talking very often, but commenting on each other's statuses when they were something we could relate to. I guess from there he learned about my move, and when he was a few hours away decided to give me a call. I wasn't home that week, but he got me on my cell. I was heading back to Michigan to go spend some time in the Upper Peninsula at my friend's cabin. It was a get-together of old high school friends. His call scared the shit out of me, and I told him where I kept my spare key. I was going to let him stay there while I was gone, for as long as he wanted. If anyone found out, he broke in while I was away. I wish it ended here, but unfortunately the worst hadn't happened to either of us. The next bit is going to be a little short, and I've changed a few of the landmarks up to keep things anonymous. This one is based on me doing a bit of internet research on one of the girls from that summer, and I really do not want anyone to bother her family. I had mostly stayed in touch with David and Ron. Occasionally I would hear something about Kelly from David, though. No one really kept up with Anne and Ryan, them being so far away and all that. I guess Ron had tried to keep in touch with Rachel after that summer, but she stopped responding to texts by the end of the fall. After hearing from David, I decided to check in on everyone that I could. AKA, I looked them up on Facebook or Googled them. Ron was off in some tropical country and had just posted a bunch of amazing photos of rainforest frogs and insects. Kelly was still in her hometown, working at a university there as a lab tech. Rachel, it seems, was missing, presumed dead. Rachel was from Wisconsin and lived in a small town along the coast of Lake Michigan. I guess she went home to her parents after that summer and wound up not going back to university that fall. I found her old Facebook page. The most recent posts were from about a year after that summer. I went further and further back until I was at the point where she had just gotten home. She kept complaining about insomnia, being nervous. I guess she wound up being checked into a mental ward for a month because her parents thought she had become anorexic. I guess she was a bit of a Facebook addict because she seemed to post multiple times a day, save for the month where she was in the ward. And then, in October of that year, she stopped posting. Her wall lit up with people sending their prayers to her family, linking to vigils being held, links on how to help find her. Everything was going crazy that month, and all I could tell was that people were looking for her, or at the very least, her body. I entered her hometown into Google with her name. There were dozens of news stories. The most recent ones were about them calling off the search. She had gone missing from her parents' house. I guess they lived on a lake, and her room had a sliding glass door that opened onto their back porch. The police report said that the glass was intact, no signs of forced entry. She was gone, though, and there was a lot of blood. In one of the photos, I could make out a blood smear on the door that looked like at one point had said swim. Some of the other stories included interviews with her friends and family. Her parents were inconsolable and blamed themselves for not listening to her. Her friends were adamant that she was being stalked and said that the police wouldn't do anything, and her parents had her committed because of it. Her body still hasn't been found. Next bit is kind of wearing me out. I'm trying to figure out what details I should put in and having trouble with it. It was only 3 weeks ago, so there's still a lot I haven't processed fully yet. If you're still waiting around, I suggest getting some snacks or a drink. I made it out to the cabin the next evening, and everyone was in incredibly bright moods. I didn't want to ruin our week out there, so I kept quiet. I was a bit detached at first, but a good bout of drinking that night helped me loosen up. The next day we went hiking, hung out at some towny bars, and went back to the cabin to play Eureka and drink. Things were awesome, and I even managed to forget about David being at my place. On the third night we got really drunk, and one of my friends decided that we should tell scary stories. Someone started out with an epic Shakespearean rendition of But Who Was Phone that involved some wealthy houses and a courier pigeon. When we figured out what was going on at the last few seconds of it, we pelted him with pretzels and cups. Another friend of mine told a totally true ghost story, and then the person to my right started on his. I was supposed to go next and had no idea what I was going to talk about until he was about 15 seconds in. The story he told was one from his grandmother. She had come over from Russia back when it was the USSR and used to love scaring her children and then grandchildren with their folklore. This story was the story of the Rusalka. Rusalka are spirits of women who die with some great sin on their heads, typically suicide by drowning. They can also be babies drowned by their parents before they're baptized. They wind up doomed to wander the earth until they can be absolved of their sins, or for the unbaptized until they can convert to Christianity. Rusalka have to stay wet. If their hair dries, they will supposedly die and wind up in hell or something. Undead dying wasn't exactly explained satisfactorily to me in this instance. I guess they would drown you or tickle you to death or something like that. It was a pretty shitty bit of folklore, but it put my mind back to where I was hoping it wouldn't be during my vacation, and I decided to tell them my true story. To keep things from getting confusing, I'm going to give them pseudonyms. There's Nick, Tim, Jeff, and Jerry. They went apeshit, laughing their asses off at me. Tim, whose cabin we were at, decided that we should go visit the Rusalka who lives in the lake where they were planning on going fishing tomorrow. I had no intention of going fishing tomorrow and had no intention of going to that lake that night. They kept insisting, laughing and teasing me the entire time. Jeff and Jerry were both pretty big guys and were both pretty drunk. We were going down to the lake no matter what, I was informed, as they both grabbed me under the arm and lifted me into the air. I protested the entire way as we scrambled behind Tim through the woods to the lake. They carried me almost a mile through the woods in the dark, and when we broke through the tree line I could see the moon shining down on a decently sized lake. We didn't stop at the tree line, though. Oh no, that would have been too simple. Jeff and Jerry carried me to the edge of the water, and on a count of 3 tossed me in as far as they could. I was fully dressed. My cell phone was in my pocket alongside my cigarettes and wallet. Everything on me was ruined as I sank about 3 feet into the muddy bottom of the lake. My head was barely above the surface, and I tried to work myself up, but I couldn't. I kept trying to pull my feet out of the muck and couldn't get anywhere. I called for help, but they were all too busy laughing at me to offer any assistance. And then something brushed up alongside me. It was long and cold and seemed to grasp at me as it passed. I screamed as loud as I could. I screamed using every obscenity I knew, every racial slur for their mutt Caucasian families I could come up with, and every bit of breath in me. They assumed it was a fish and laughed all the harder at my screams until it pulled me under the water. I gasped as soon as my head went under and took in a huge mouthful of water. I couldn't see anything through all the dirt I had kicked up while struggling, but I could feel long fingers grasping me, tipped with little sharp points pulling me further into the lake. My head was spinning and the world started to go black when I felt a tug from the opposite direction. Another tug and I burst out of the water and was dragged back up onto the shore. Tim and Jeff had pulled me out of the water. They figured I was just drunk and had slipped in and forgotten how to swim. Jerry and Nick were still laughing their asses off, but once my head stopped swimming and I finished coughing up water, I could hear the giggling. I looked out towards the lake, and there, out near the middle, I could make out the silhouette of someone with long hair, their torso bobbing up and down out of the water. I pointed, but couldn't form any words. Jerry had noticed it too and stopped laughing. The others instantly got quiet, and the giggling sounded louder than a jet flying overhead. They helped me up, and we backed away from the water, trying not to let it out of our sights. It dove back under, towards us, and we all turned and ran. The run back to the cabin seemed to take hours, even though it must have only been a few minutes. We locked all the doors, and Jeff went to his pack and pulled out a small black case. He entered a combination on it, opened it, and took out his handgun. None of us knew he had brought it, but we really didn't care at that point. After everyone regained their cool a little bit, Tim asked me about my leg. I had been completely oblivious to it, but my jeans were ripped to shreds down at the ankle, and blood was seeping out around the tears. Jeff handed me a pocket knife, and I cut away the bottom of the leg and wrapped it up in gauze. No one said anything for a long while, but we each grabbed a beer at some point and started drinking in silence. I woke up to Nick yelling at Jeff to get up. Something was outside. I woke up and immediately turned to Nick, who was standing by a large window facing the woods. We had all nodded off in the living room, sitting wherever we were the night before. The sun was rising and I could hear birds off in the distance. And, of course, there on the window was that word again. Swim. Jeff was staring intently at the window, his gun held in both hands. Nick was pointing towards the woods, yelling, kill it," over and over again. I couldn't see anything. None of us could. By that point, whatever Nick had seen was long gone. We got him to calm down and he told us about it. He woke up to a giggling coming from right next to his head and turned to face the window where the word was written. Outside he could see a face with a wide, toothy grin filled with thin, pointed teeth. We packed immediately and agreed to meet up in town. There was a truck stop diner we could go to and sit and think. We went out to our cars and stopped. The tires were flat. Every single one had been slashed several times. I started to freak out. All of us did. There wasn't any phone signal out there, and the nearby cabins were empty for all but a few weeks each year. It took us a few minutes to grasp what had happened, but by the time we were coherent, Jeff had unpacked his gun again. We loaded what we could into backpacks. I was the only one with a proper backpacking pack and had brought all of my stuff in it. I had space to spare though, so I emptied my spare clothes as we loaded anything that might be irreplaceable in it. I hefted it onto my back and we started out down the road. Jeff had moved his pistol into a jacket pocket, accessible but hidden. I was pretty sure this involved at least one felony where we were, but it wasn't a point I cared to bring up. We were a few miles from a nearby highway and even more miles still from the nearest town. All told, we walked for nearly 10 hours without stopping for food or water. I could do little more than hobble on my right leg, and it made everyone pissed off. I blamed them for throwing me in the water. They wanted to blame me for being so slow. We were in terrible shape by the time we reached a little diner and went inside to eat. We sat there without talking, gulping down as much water as we could between bites of food. Tim finally checked his cell phone and informed us that he had a signal. We were at the diner for over 5 hours waiting for a tow truck. By the time it showed up, the sun was setting, and none of us wanted to go back out there. The driver refused to navigate by himself, as the roads were twisted and unmarked for much of the drive. Jeff volunteered to go with him, as long as Tim came to help navigate. They went back and forth, bringing our vehicles into town. Jeff and Jerry drove together, but the rest of us were on our own on the way up. After the third car, they came to check in on us and to let us know they were almost done snagging our cars and to suggest we check into a motel where he would drop Jeff and Tim off when they were finished. We begrudgingly walked to the motel and asked for one room for 5 people. The clerk looked at me, inquisitively, and told me that they enforced quiet hours, and if we were allowed after 11 p.m., he was going to call the police. I shrugged and accepted the key from him, and we walked down to where it was. It was a little over an hour before Tim and Jeff got back. The previous trips have taken about a quarter of the time. We were getting antsy, and when they finally did return, it did nothing to help alleviate our tension. They got there on the last trip and immediately thought something was off. There were no crickets chirping, no birds singing, no noises at all. The forest was dead as far as they could tell. Jeff warily got out of the car and kept watch on the trees while the tow truck driver went to work hitching up the last car. When the driver finished hitching up the car, they started to hear it, a soft, melodic singing. They all heard it, but all swore it was coming from different directions. The singing was coming from all around them, interrupted here and there by soft giggling. The driver nervously walked back towards his truck, and Jeff drew his pistol. Tim had never gotten out of the car and was now screaming for them to get back inside. The driver got in, but as Jeff made his way back to the passenger side, he noticed something. There was a trail of water leading up to the car, and a pool was forming beneath it. Jeff yelled at Tim to open the door wider, and he stood as far back from the truck as he could, aiming at the ground below it. Tim was near hysterical, and it took him a few seconds to swing the door open. Jeff prepared to make a running jump for the door, hoping to avoid anything beneath it. He lowered his gun, and from right behind him he heard someone giggle. He took off as fast as he could and leapt into the side door of the car. He face-planted in the driver's lap and yelled, "Move, move, move," as loud as he could. Tim struggled to close the door, and as they were driving out, it slammed into something. Tim got the door closed, and Jeff managed to right himself in his seat. The driver had stopped after the impact, and Jeff readied his pistol and looked back out the window. The gun barked rapidly, far too quickly for Jeff to have been taking aim with each shot, and the wheels spun beneath them as the driver panicked and tried to floor it. The singing had stopped entirely and had been replaced by a loud cackling as they drove out of there as fast as they could. The car they were towing, however, wasn't having any of their speeding. It careened off the road behind them and got stuck in a ditch, still hooked to them. The cackling died down and was replaced again by singing. They sat there, quiet and unmoving for what felt like hours. No one wanted to get out. Everyone was terrified of what was around them. Jeff noticed a stinging pain in his back and reached his arm around to investigate. His fingers came back wet with blood, and the calm was broken. Tim started freaking out, babbling about how they had to get out of there. The driver was yelling at them for getting him involved in this shit. The inside of the car was chaotic, and the singing turned back into laughter, rising in volume with their shouting. They were so focused on arguing with each other that no one was watching around the car. When they heard a scratching on the side of the door, time seemed to stop. The driver and Tim seized up and stopped talking. Jeff opened fire wildly at the passenger door. The cackling got louder. He fired until his gun clicked empty and started swearing under his breath and fumbling in his pockets for more ammo. The creature on the side of the car stood up and smiled. There were a few holes in its upper chest that leaked a dark blue liquid very slowly. It looked like congealed blood, but had no hint of red color to it. It reached its arms towards the car door, and they suddenly realized it was unlocked. As the handle clicked open, the driver threw open the glove box and pulled out a revolver and shot the thing over and over again. Gouts of blue liquid sprayed out of it, and it collapsed backwards. A wave of bravery swept over them, and Jeff reloaded his gun and pushed the door open. The driver stepped out of his side and rushed back to the car. He quickly unhooked the winch and darted back to his seat, yelling for Jeff to get back in. Jeff complied immediately. They closed their doors and took off as fast as they could, Jeff and Tim staring back behind them at the creature and the strange blue liquid leaking out of it on the road behind them. The driver refused to speak, and when they got to the motel he stopped and stared straight ahead. They quietly got out of the truck and he left down the road without looking back. They found the way to our room after asking the clerk about us and caught us up on what had happened. It was my car that they left, and as I lived further than any of them and in the opposite direction, I was pretty upset about it. No one wanted to drive that far out of their way. It had taken me 16 hours to get there. We argued for a while, and eventually I decided I was just going to have to get another car. There were a few cheap used car lots around us, and none of us had any interest in trying to recover my vehicle. None of us slept that night. How could we? We stayed up staring at the doors and windows, Jeff with his gun in his lap and us with anything we could possibly use as weapons. After the lamps were taken, I had to settle for a toilet plunger to keep me safe. Luckily, nothing happened that night, and we all got up groggily and went to get breakfast from the diner. We didn't talk much. No one knew what we could possibly say. After breakfast, Nick called the tow truck company, and the guy who answered informed him that our tires were changed, no charge if we got them before noon that day. None of us wanted anything more than to get out of there, and that's exactly what we did. We called a cab to the auto shop, then Tim drove me to a used car lot. I paid with plastic for the first car that seemed like it would get me home and waved goodbye to Tim. I got home and my doors were unlocked. Dave was gone, and my spare key was sitting on my dining room table. This was a few weeks ago, and I haven't heard from him. His phone is disconnected. He hasn't been online, and no one I can get in touch with seems to know where he is. I called his parents, and they told me the last they heard was that his car was impounded outside of the state, in my county. It had been abandoned on a side street in a residential neighborhood. I've been finding sand in my carpet. He probably just tracked it in when he was here, I think, but I can't shake it. It's in every room, just little trace amounts of sand. If you run your hand across the fabric, little bits of it spray back up at you. There are a few water stains, too, that weren't there before. I haven't been sleeping much, hence me being on here at nearly 3 a.m. I live near a highway, but I swear I keep hearing noises at night over the sound of the cars. Every now and then, just a distant giggling and a nagging desire to go for a swim.